Based on recent developments, something unusual is happening in the intersection of global trade and military posture that suggests we are moving into a new, more complex phase of the US-China relationship. While the headlines often focus on the friction between these two superpowers, a closer look at the data from the past few days reveals a strategic dance where economic necessity is frequently overriding geopolitical rhetoric. We are seeing a moment where the US military is actively engaged in the Strait of Hormuz to protect commercial shipping, while simultaneously, the White House is preparing a massive corporate delegation for a high-stakes summit in Beijing. It raises a fundamental question. How can a nation manage a direct military confrontation in the Middle East while seeking a multi-billion-dollar commercial truce with its primary global rival? To understand this, we have to look past the surface-level politics and into the hard numbers of the global supply chain. Think of the current global economy like a high-performance engine that is running extremely hot while the cooling system is starting to leak. On May 7th, Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammack made it clear that interest rates are likely to stay exactly where they are, between 3.5% and 3.75% for the foreseeable future. This isn't just a cautious central bank being hawkish. It's a direct response to the fact that US inflation has remained above the 2% target for more than 5 years. When you combine that persistent internal pressure with the external reality of oil prices topping $110 a barrel, the Fed's hands are essentially tied. The primary driver here isn't just domestic spending, but the physical cost of moving goods through a world where the most vital maritime choke points are becoming active combat zones. This brings us to the Strait of Hormuz, where the U.S. Navy is currently intercepting Iranian attacks on commercial vessels, including Maersk shipping ships. This isn't just a tactical military exercise, it's a massive logistical subsidy for the global economy. When the U.S. military steps in to protect these lanes, they are effectively trying to prevent that $110 oil from climbing to $150, which would essentially reset the inflation clock for the entire Western world. But here's the curiosity gap that analysts are currently grappling with. Why is the US taking on the full burden of securing these lanes when the primary beneficiary of stable energy prices is often the manufacturing machine of China? It's a paradox of modern power. The US provides the security for a global trade system that China has mastered more effectively than anyone else. Now, let's look at the legal landscape back home, which just threw a significant wrench into the administration's leverage. On May 8th, the U.S. Court of International Trade issued a 2-1 decision ruling that the 10% global tariffs implemented by the Trump administration were illegal under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, while the court limited the block to Washington state and 2 private importers for now. The signal it sends is unmistakable. It suggests that the tariff hammer might be losing its structural integrity just as the president prepares to head to Beijing on May 14th. If the court eventually expands this ruling to cover all importers before the July mandate expires, the US loses its primary piece of economic pressure. But would that even matter to Beijing? According to recent reporting, the answer might be a surprising no. While the US political system debates the legality of these tariffs, Chinese manufacturers have largely become numb to them. The data shows that China finished 2025 with a staggering $126 trillion trade surplus. Even though their exports to the US fell by 20%, they didn't just lose that business, they moved it. They increased exports to Africa by over 25%, Southeast Asia by 13%, and even the EU by 8%. This indicates a massive pattern recognition insight. China has successfully neutralized the impact of US trade policy by aggressively diversifying into the global south. They are no longer waiting for the US consumer to come back. They are building new consumers elsewhere. This shift creates a massive challenge for the high-powered group of CEOs joining the president on his trip to Beijing next week. The roster includes the leaders of Nvidia, Apple, Exxon, Boeing, Qualcomm, and Citigroup. This isn't just a courtesy invite. It's a recognition that the American private sector is still deeply tethered to the Chinese ecosystem. For companies like Apple and Nvidia, the de-risking rhetoric of the last few years has met the cold reality of manufacturing gravity. Consider Genomex Group, which still keeps 75% of its 500 suppliers in China, or Pride Mobility, which remains up to 80% reliant on Chinese components. Why haven't they moved? Because the cost of leaving is currently higher than the cost of staying, especially when you factor in the sheer scale of the Chinese infrastructure. But it's not just about consumer electronics, it's about the very foundation of US national security. The data on the U.S. defense industrial base is particularly sobering. 2 decades ago, there were over 360 defense-related manufacturers such as foundries and forging operations in the United States. Today, that number has plummeted to fewer than 120. This raises an important question. If the U.S. were to engage in a prolonged conflict, does it even have the domestic capacity to replenish its own stockpiles without relying on a global supply chain that Beijing increasingly controls? It's a vulnerability that Cameron Johnson of Tidal Wave Solutions calls the ultimate trump card: China's monopoly on rare earth elements. These materials are the oxygen of the modern tech economy, and they are critical for everything from the semiconductors in an iPhone to the guidance systems of the missiles the Navy is currently firing in the Middle East. This brings us to the core of the upcoming summit. On one hand, you have a U.S. administration trying to maintain a position of strength and economic pressure. On the other, you have Boeing negotiating a potential order for 500 737 jets and dozens of wide-body aircraft. Think of it like this: the U.S. is trying to play a game of chess where the goal is long-term strategic independence, but the immediate need for a multi-billion-dollar win for an iconic American company like Boeing might force a tactical compromise. A deal of that magnitude would provide a massive boost to the U.S. aerospace sector, but it would also likely require reciprocal concessions that could undermine the very decoupling efforts the government has been promoting. The tension here is between what Eric Zheng of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai calls a truce versus a long-term plan. A truce, like the one being sought in Beijing next week, might lower the temperature for 90 days or even 6 months. It might see China agree to buy more American soybeans or Boeing jets in exchange for a pause on new export controls. But for the CEOs on that plane, the real question is whether this is just a temporary lull in a permanent storm. Companies need to plan for 5 to 10 years, not the next news cycle. If the legal system in the U.S. is blocking tariffs, and the military is busy securing oil lanes that help fuel Chinese factories, the incentive for private firms to reshore back to the U.S. starts to look more like a political suggestion than an economic necessity. This leads us to a deeper, more systemic issue that isn't being discussed in the daily briefings: the role of AI in mapping these supply chains. There is a frantic effort right now to use advanced AI to identify sub-tier suppliers, those small companies 3 or 4 levels down the chain that provide the specialized materials for U.S. defense platforms. The concern is that even if a product says made in the USA, its DNA might still be 70% Chinese. As the U.S. military targets Iranian facilities to protect global shipping, how many of the components in those very weapon systems originated in a factory in Shenzhen? It's a level of integration that makes the concept of a clean break almost impossible without a total transformation of the global order. Based on current data, we are seeing a split-screen reality. In one frame, the U.S. team is exerting military and legal pressure to maintain its role as the global guarantor of stability. In the other, the titans of American industry are flying to Beijing to secure their place in a market they cannot afford to lose. This creates an environment of strategic positioning rather than a direct siege. The upcoming summit isn't just about trade. It's about testing whether the U.S. can still leverage its market power when its legal and economic tools are being challenged at home. The $110 oil and the $3, 5% interest rates aren't just numbers on a screen. They are the boundaries of what is politically possible. If the president can return from Beijing with a massive Boeing order and a commitment for China to help de-escalate the situation in the Middle East, it would be a significant tactical victory. But it wouldn't solve the underlying problem of a hollowed-out U.S. manufacturing base or the $120 trillion surplus that allows China to look past the American consumer. As we look toward the May 14th summit, the most critical data point won't be the final handshake, but the fine print regarding rare earth materials and semiconductor exemptions. This raises a final looming question that we haven't yet answered. Is the U.S. delegation going to Beijing to set the terms of a new era, or are they going there to manage a relationship where the leverage has already shifted? The answer to that will determine the trajectory of the global economy for the next decade, and it's a story that is only just beginning to unfold. To understand where this leverage currently sits, we have to look at the structural reality beneath the diplomatic surface. The question of whether the U.S. is setting terms or merely managing a shift in power depends largely on how we interpret the current state of industrial inertia. For the last several years, the public narrative has been dominated by the idea of reshoring, the movement of manufacturing back to American soil. However, according to recent reporting from market sources, the private sector's behavior tells a much more complicated story. Many U.S. Manufacturers have not only delayed their relocation plans but have actively chosen to maintain 70% to 80% of their operations in China. Why would they do this in an environment of high-level geopolitical tension? Think of it like a massive ocean liner. Even if the captain signals a hard turn, the sheer momentum of the vessel keeps it moving in the original direction for miles. In this case, the momentum is the established, ultra-efficient supply chain infrastructure that China has spent decades perfecting. This leads us to a significant curiosity gap. If private companies aren't moving, does that mean the government's de-risking strategy is failing, or is it simply being bypassed? Based on recent market movements. Based on recent movements. While the administration uses AI to map supply chains and identify vulnerabilities, companies are finding that the economic cost of leaving is often higher than the potential risk of staying. This is particularly true when you consider that many of these firms are looking at the legal system for relief. The recent 2-1 decision by the U.S. Court of International Trade, which ruled the 10% global tariffs illegal under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, provides a perfect example. While the ruling is currently limited to Washington state and to private importers, it creates a precedent that other companies are watching closely. If the court expands this block before the mandate expires in July, the primary economic deterrent for staying in China, the tariff, suddenly evaporates. This raises an important question. If the legal system effectively dismantles the government's trade leverage, what tools are left to influence corporate behavior? The answer likely lies in the strategic composition of the delegation headed to Beijing on May 14th. By bringing the CEOs of NVIDIA, Apple, and Qualcomm, the administration is acknowledging that high-tech semiconductors and consumer electronics are the real front lines. But there is a pattern recognition insight here that we shouldn't miss. These tech leaders aren't just there to support the president's agenda. They are likely there to secure their own interests, specifically exemptions from existing export controls. In a world where China finished 2025 with a $1.2 trillion trade surplus despite U.S. restrictions, the leverage might actually be in the hands of the companies that provide the essential components for both economies. This creates a circular dependency. The U.S. needs these companies to stay ahead in the AI race, but these companies need the Chinese market and manufacturing base to fund and build that very technology. This brings us to a stark statistic that frames the long-term geopolitical stakes. The number of U.S. defense-related manufacturers, specifically in foundries and forgings, has dropped from over 360 2 decades ago to fewer than 120 today. That is a 66% decline in the foundational industrial capacity required to maintain a modern military. Now, compare that to the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz. As the U.S. military intercepts Iranian attacks to protect commercial shipping, they're using advanced platforms that rely on a supply chain that has been significantly hollowed out. Analysts suggest this is the most critical intelligence gap we face. How deeply are Chinese-affiliated sub-tier suppliers integrated into the very missiles and defense systems currently being deployed in the Middle East? If the very tools being used to secure global trade are dependent on a rival supply chain, the concept of strategic independence becomes much more fragile. Think of the global economy as a complex biological system. You can't simply remove one vital organ without affecting the others. The Iranian conflict is a perfect example of this interconnectedness. While geopolitical sources frame the ship interceptions as a tactical military matter, financial reporting shows that these events are a primary driver of entrenched inflation in the United States. When the U.S. military targets Iranian facilities, the immediate result is a spike in oil prices to $110 a barrel. This in turn forces the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates high at 3.5% to 3.75%, which then increases the cost of borrowing for the very U.S. companies that are supposed to be reshoring. It's a feedback loop where military action intended to protect the economy ends up creating the very inflationary pressures that constrain it. This raises a provocative question. At what point does the cost of maintaining global stability exceed the economic benefit of the stability itself? This brings us back to the upcoming summit and the potential Boeing deal for 500 aircraft. On the surface, a multi-billion-dollar order is a massive win for U.S. manufacturing. But in the context of China's rare earth trump card, the deal looks more like a strategic trade-off. Beijing holds a near monopoly on the elements required for high-end aerospace and semiconductor production. If China agrees to buy 500 Boeing jets, what will they demand in return regarding the flow of these materials? Based on current reporting, it's possible that a truce in the trade war is the only way for both sides to prevent a total systemic collapse. As Eric Shung of AmCham Shanghai noted, a truce is better than a war, but it is inherently temporary. For companies like Boeing or Apple, a 90-day pause doesn't solve the long-term problem of structural decoupling. It just pushes the deadline further down the road. Looking at the broader pattern, we are seeing the emergence of a dual-track global economy. On one track, we have the official government rhetoric of competition, tariffs, and military escalation. On the second track, we have the exporter reality, where Chinese manufacturers are successfully diverting their goods to Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe to offset US losses. This indicates that the world is becoming less unipolar and more multipolar in a very literal, logistical sense. China's exports to Africa rose by 25.8% and to Southeast Asia by 13.4% in the last year alone. They aren't just surviving the trade war. They're building a new global trade architecture that doesn't rely on the US consumer as the sole engine of growth. This may indicate that the economic pressure environment created by US tariffs is having the unintended consequence of accelerating the development of a China-centric trade bloc in the global south. So, what are the long-term scenarios we should be considering? One possibility is that we are entering an era of managed competition where the US and China agree to a series of transactional truces like the Boeing deal to keep their respective economies from overheating, while continuing to compete fiercely in the shadows of cyber warfare and AI development. A second, more challenging scenario is one where the US industrial base continues to shrink and the cost of military intervention in places like the Strait of Hormuz becomes unsustainable, forcing a more significant retreat from the role of global guarantor. This isn't a guarantee, but the current data on foundries and interest rates suggests it is a risk that policymakers are taking very seriously. This leads to a final, forward-looking insight. The real story of the May 14th summit won't be found in the joint press releases or the photos of the two presidents shaking hands. It will be found in the movement of the CEOs in the background. If companies like Nvidia and Apple secure the exemptions they are looking for, it will be a signal that the global tech ecosystem is simply too integrated to be broken by political mandates. The intelligence gap that remains is whether the US government has the capacity to rebuild its domestic industrial base fast enough to matter, or if the rare earth trump card and the surplus shield have already moved the goalposts. As we watch the events in Beijing and the Middle East unfold, we are witnessing the birth of a new kind of power, one that isn't measured just by the number of ships in a strait, but by the resilience of a supply chain that no one nation can truly control. This isn't just a trade war or a regional conflict, it's the recalibration of the global engine, and the next few weeks will tell us just how much friction the system can actually handle.